I didn't want to take up everybody's time today with tools, because there are already so many great tools out there that we've seen in today's sessions. The session before lunch that Ivan was conducting, some really superb tools there. But without a reproducible methodology, all you've got is a great toolbox, and it's very much like any craftsman. You can have the biggest, best tools in the world. It's actually down to how you learn to wield those tools. And I'm very much a proponent of OsInt not just being a tool set and not being a piece of software. It's more than that. It's an investigative skill set. And one of the key things that people need to accept with OsInt is that you're actually enhancing the ability of the investigator. It doesn't matter whether you put him in his office, in his car, in a remote location, whether he moves from one company to another company. The ability that he has is going to migrate with him. And as long as you're vendor agnostic and you work with true open source tools, you should be able to reproduce the content, the investigative context in any environment. So that's really what I want to talk to you about today, is to look at the investigative methodologies. And when we talk about investigative methodology, I often find that we're conducting big sessions, great people, terrific audiences, but they haven't always been schooled in the different investigative methods. Now, we're kind of constrained for time today, so we're not going to go into all of them, but we are going to just look at a few of them to understand them in the context of OsInt. So what is an investigative methodology? Well, it's a reproducible method. And that doesn't mean it's fixed. It doesn't mean that your methodology has got to be cast in stone, that it can't be fluid according to the requirements of each investigation. If you've worked in OsInt for a while, you'll know by now that pretty much every case is different. The type of data that you're going to need, the chain that you're going to follow is going to be different, and the outcome that you're looking for will also be slightly different. So we're going to talk a bit about investigative methodology. Because we've come so much further, we've gone further than Sherlock Holmes and instinct. Instinct plays an immensely important role in OsInt, obviously, but there's more to it than that. You've got to be able to take what you're doing, reproduce it within the team. If you cannot say that, quite honestly, right now, if you walked up to a team of 5 of your colleagues that were doing research and you picked up one of their assignments, they would all be replications of what you would have done with a little bit of finesse on each, but they would have covered the same bases that you do. If you can't do that, you could have a problem within your organization where you're getting inconsistent results. So we're going to look at those methods in a moment, and we're going to look at how the methods of investigation translate into the digital space. So let's step back. Let's look at typical conventional investigative methodology. So the first one we look at is a witness account. Now, a witness account is always atypical of a policing, visible policing type investigation. Police officer arrives at a scene, he reviews the scene, he speaks to witnesses. What did they see? What did they experience? What do they normally see? What was different? What happened before the incident? What happened after the incident? And any little nuances that might help them to flesh out the detail. They're then going to take one witness's statement, compare it to another's, and they're going to look for any inconsistencies in those statements. They're going to look for an overcompensation of detail, perhaps an attempt to manipulate the timeline. In that cross-referencing process, they're going to come across more witness account statements that need to be taken, and so the investigation progresses. Second one I want to look at is a timeline. Now, a timeline is atypical of what you and I may refer to as a detective style investigation. We're going to look at a sequence of events, and we're going to break them down into minute chunks. What specifically happened at what period in time? What happened thereafter, and are there any lapses in that timeline? What data can we get that's going to support or refute the timeline, or help us to be conclusive on any particular points in that sequence? It's very atypical of normal police detective work where you're working with murder cases or complicated financial crimes, and you want to follow the sequencing as closely as possible. So that will be a typical timeline investigation. The third investigative form that we're going to look at is a baseline. And that really speaks to the heart of a lot of what we do in the digital world. If you cannot measure it, you can't manage it. The path that an email follows from my computer to your computer will be different to the path that it follows from somebody sitting inside working off a Wi-Fi card within my office. Could be different service providers that follow a different path. So in order to get to the answers there, we use a baseline method. We decide what should this data look like, what is the sample that we have, and what does it look like, and we complete a microanalysis of it to see where the points of variation might be. Which brings us to Locard's principle. Locard's principle, of course, is the foundation of modern forensic sciences, and it's the principle of every contact leaves a trace. If I walk past a wall and I brush against it, I leave a trace of paint from the wall on my shirt. I leave a trace of fiber from my shirt on the wall. Every time I touch a keyboard, I also leave a trace. It could be a trace on my router, it could be a trace on my local machine, via my service provider, it could be on a server that I'm communicating with, sending a message to, creating a new mail address, but there will be a trace. And often in cybercrime investigations specifically, where we're working with OsInt as a tool and an investigative tool set, the need exists to baseline transactions, transactional processing. It could be a simple thing like recreating the path of registration of a domain to see where there could be additional evidence. So we have a witness account, we have a timeline, we have a baseline method. And then finally, we have the forensic method, which is quite simply inferences from the Latin before the public, and it has an underlying basis of science, whether it's data science, medical science, bioscience, there's a scientific basis to it. So those are just four of the known and all well-taught investigative methods, and there are more, obviously, but these are the four I just want to focus on this evening. These four methods all translate reasonably well into the digital space and become part of the way that we investigate in the online environment. So let's break down what does a typical OsInt methodology look like. Well, we start by taking the scope of work, and this is where a lot of projects fall short. What's the desired objective? What's the outcome here? What do we want to achieve? And what is it that we need to get? Now, I've learned via school of hard knocks of 20 years of doing this, that the scope is critical. Give me 5 things that you want to know in your investigation. Please don't tell me you want to know everything about the subject of my research, because I'm going to want to tell you what he had for breakfast. If I want to tell you what he had for breakfast, well, then I want to know, is he likely to do it again tomorrow? Does he have different breakfasts on different days? How did he pay for that breakfast? Is that breakfast within his financial means? I'm going to be quite specific, and I'm going to really mount the data on. So taking the scope of work from your client is always going to be pivotal to what you're going to do next. What do you want? What are the expected outcomes, and how should I deliver them? If I don't have an accurate scope, well, it's not possible for me to deliver on the expectation. The second component is, which layer of the internet am I most likely to find this on? Am I going to find that data on the surface web, deep web, dark web? Where am I going to start looking? Because I'm going to need obviously different tool sets and a different approach. So before I even start the investigation, I need to start guiding where I'm going to be looking for that data. Finally, I'm going to identify the tools that are going to aid in my research. And tool set choice is really critical to OsInt. There's more considerations than just, will this tool serve the end? Let's say, for example, you're working in a criminal environment, criminal investigation. Then part of your selection of your tool set is obviously going to be the integrity of the tool. when you use that tool, what data is it keeping about your searches, and what parameters is it providing you to search by? One of my overriding considerations is always going to be, how much data is this going to create in my search? What are they going to keep in pattern about me and my searching habits, and how can I retain that privacy? Do I need to? I've seen plenty of great tools online, for example, that do metadata identification out of PDFs, JPEGs, PNG files, but they do keep the data that you're providing, including the PDF that you've uploaded, for quite a period of time. And if you're working with criminal matters, that's really suboptimal. It's not something that you want to do. Then I'm going to get to the research phase. I'm going to conduct my research, and that's where I'm going to be moving through different tools. I'm going to go through different sets of data, and I'm going to really be harvesting everything that I can find on the subject. The next step is going to be the analysis. Analyzing the data, looking at points of cross-reference. One point of reference is insufficient. I want 3 points of reference to each fact that I find online, and I want something to support it. Let's say, for example, I find a phone number, and much like we were looking at in the previous sessions before lunch, the use of the Facebook breach data to identify phone numbers that go with Facebook profiles. Well, that's great, but you've got to remember, it's breach data. There is a question on the authenticity of the data. It's not empirical by any means. You can take a sample, a data sample, and you can check through it, but it's still breach data. You don't know the method of the breach, you don't know the intent of the breach, and you don't know the authenticity of that data. It's still untested. So you've got to treat it with a little bit of circumspection and find alternative tools to verify the answer that you've achieved. Once you've got to the answer, you obviously need to capture your results. Now, every court around the world is going to have a different version on how it wants data presented. For the most part, the hashing, the creation of a hash file, the definitive URL, and the time and date stamp at which it was visited needs to be collated and put together in your report. Your report, of course, report writing, totally different topic, much more that can be said about that. But let's just say this: be concise and be factual in your outcomes. Your task within an OsInt investigation is to find specific pieces of data, to verify it, comment on the veracity of the data, the context of the data, and to pull it together in a report that somebody can understand without having to go through several hundred pages of additional research. So your tool suitability and selection is something that we just touched on. Firstly, your tool's got to be fit to purpose. I mean, obviously, it has to deliver the result in the data that you want. Data retention. If it's an online tool, you need to satisfy yourself that there's a reasonable period within which it's retaining your data and whatever you may have uploaded to it to interrogate. Could be a photo analysis tool, it could be a metadata analysis tool, but you do need to know what the data retention is if it's there, and you need to know how that website is profiling the searches that you're conducting. It's quite easy to pattern an investigator. I think if you've been doing OsInt for a while, even if you are sitting behind a VPN, Google probably has a really strange opinion of you and the eclectic bunch of things that you search for in a day. You've got to be mindful of patterning, whether it's on a search engine, online in general, or on a specific tool. So I try not to be too dependent on one tool. If I've got a tool, whether it's an IP tracker, for example, I'll always have 2 others as backups, and that I will swap between. So I'm not using one incessantly. I can swap between 2 or 3 tools in order to help mix up that patterning. Have alternatives handy. You never know when a tool is going to die. It could go offline. It could just be that the data service is not available. You've got to have alternatives and always be on the lookout for alternatives to that tool set. We've seen that so many times within OsInt over the years where terrific tool sets have been available. And then like that one morning, they change and they're paid for. They've reached the pinnacle user count that they need, and then now swap over to a paid for model. So that is something that you've got to consider. If this tool were to become paid for tomorrow, what other alternatives can I get to it? And stay true to the concept of open source. So in terms of your minimum baseline method and reproducing the method that you use, you have to have something obviously like a bookmark manager. Personally, I use start.me, but pretty much any bookmark manager would work. And the reason I use bookmark managers is not as much to keep track of my tool set. Well, it's obviously handy for that, but it's not the intended purpose. The bookmark manager allows me to create the baseline of the tools that I'm going to use and the order in which I'm going to use them. So if I task my research team downstairs to do some work, and I ask them, for example, to look at a telephone number, we have an agreed set of minimum tools and minimum checks that need to be conducted on that phone number. And we use bookmark management tools to enforce that method, to share tools between us, and to see that we have a consistency. So in this example you're seeing on screen, and again, it's just, that's a particular tool that I like. I use start.me, and we'll set up some basic links, and it gives me the ability to follow those links through and open all of the tabs if I need to, get all 15 going, and then work from left to right. Now, why do I do that? I'm an investigator, but I'm also a geek. And sometimes I'll be looking for the answer. I'm so focused on the answer and getting the outcomes that I need that I'm diving into a set of data and, oh, look, a squirrel. And suddenly I'm gone off in that direction. And I forget to go back and cover one or two bases that are really rudimentary and I should have done in the first place. But I've gotten so detracted by what I think might take me to the answer, I haven't gone back just to finish those steps. So I find that bookmark managers are really essential in helping me keep that workflow and follow that workflow, whether it's Intel in the office with my staff following the same methodology and creating a reproducible outcome. And please, you can use any tool you like, as long as it allows you to keep track of your tool sets and to follow the minimum methodology. You have to have a minimum. You can go above and beyond that, but you've got to bear in mind the golden rule. Set the standard. If you're working in a team, set the standard low. It doesn't matter. You can increase it over time if you have a minimum level. If you don't have a minimum, you're going to have inconsistent results. Today, the OsInt investigation is going to come in. It's going to be a terrific result. You bang on the mark. You've got what you want. Tomorrow, not so much. Day after, it could be okay. And then it's back to a phenomenal result in the investigation. And that's not something you can take to market or that you can use as an investigator. You need to build the consistency in your method and in your output. And using tools like bookmark managers is a terrific way to help enforce that flow and that method. Latches and pivots. You've got to be able to identify latches and drill into all of the pivot points around that data. This is where things like visualization really become important. It's just impossible to take a complicated advanced fee fraud scam or business email compromise even and mine through all of the data that's involved without some kind of visual representation. Now, I know that I'm by nature a visual person, and I like to have diagrams that follow my work. Whether your diagram is drafted in an analyst notebook, draw.io, or Multigo, even if you need to, or on a piece of paper with a handful of crayons, you have to get visual. Visualizing your latches and pivots is what's going to help you to recreate the path that you followed. And one of the challenges people often face with OsInt investigations is that you can spend 3 days investigating, accumulate 100 pages of supporting data. At the end of the day, if it's a critical investigation, you might only have 5 or 10 minutes to present your outcomes to a decision maker that could be doing anything from making a financial decision through to a tactical decision based on the data that you're going to deliver to them. Having good link analysis diagrams that show your latch and your pivot points and how you follow the chain of the data is pretty critical in being able to summarize your work in a way that everybody can understand without being technical, and to help you follow your train of thought and your path. So it doesn't matter which tool that you use. The ones you're seeing on the screen are analyst notebook diagrams, but it can be any visual diagramming tool. You can do it in Word or PowerPoint for all I care, as long as it shows your workflow. I like to use diagrams that allow me to float from one piece of data, from a latch to a pivot point, and again back to other pivot points, in order to make sure that I don't have any dead legs. Now, dead legs, if you look at the top left slide, you'll see there's an address over there. That is the end point. Well, that's a dead leg, because I could still draw into that address. The address at the top on the right is still a dead leg. It might go nowhere, but if I wanted to pick this investigation up 6 months' time and carry on, the dead legs are the first place that I'm going to start to re-extend the data that I've acquired. So the visualization of your latch and your pivots is actually quite key in reminding yourself what you may or may not have covered, ensuring that you've kept a consistent workflow, and that the presentation of your material is in a similar vein to the presentation of a colleague's material, so that you can swap between yourselves and follow the line of thought. This is a pretty standard latch and pivot diagram where you can see, I'm sure this is not terribly new to you, but if it is, it's taking a starting point of a classifieds advert, then exploring each data point that's there. The cellular number has got other data attached to it. The domain itself has got a registrar, a registrant, and it's got a payment gateway, because I've tried to put hard cash into my monitor to pay for domains. It just doesn't work. There's got to be a payment gateway and a data record that goes with that. We take a simple example of a cell phone, for example. A phone number could well be used on Facebook. So via the breach data, it could have a number attached to it. A phone number could have a listing on Truecaller. Now, some of these that you're going to see here are particular to South Africa, which is where I'm from, as you'll hear from my oddball accent. But I'm sure you'll follow the idea. A phone number could equally have a LinkedIn account associated to it. It could have an Uber account associated to it. And the spin-offs from that could be, it could be an Uber driver, or it could be an Uber passenger account. There could be surface web data. What can Google find with a quick search? Instagram, porting databases that will show you who the service provider of that number is. HLR and VLR, home location register, visitor location register. Is that cell phone currently in the country that it's from, or is that cell phone possibly roaming? If so, where's the home location and where is it currently roaming? Mr. Delivery, if you have any kind of food delivery service in the country that you're from, you will probably find there's a sign-up process that you could use the forgotten password fallback method in order to find out if there is data attached to that number and the use of it. Mapping services like Waze, GPS services. You can use account finders and people finders like Spokeo, Phone Info Gear, credit databases, Rocket Reach, WhatsApp. WhatsApp should give you a profile photo. If it gives you a profile photo, you want to reverse image search the profile photo. Is it a generic photo? Is it a unique photo? Are they on Telegram? What can you learn from their Telegram activity? You want to search breach data, obviously, which will be specific, of course, to each country and what breach data may or may not be available? Is there a TikTok account associated to it? So it's very often that a client will approach us as well. Can you tell me anything about this phone number? Well, I can tell you a lot about that phone number, including one of the really important parts of OsInt. And I find a lot of the young investigators struggle with this. They will sit and they will work on one cell phone and come at it from every possible angle. And after 2, 3 hours, 4 hours of research, they have nothing. No answer is still an answer. If all of your searches has yielded no data, it's not that you're not delivering any value to your client. There's still value in that. No answer is still an answer. If there is no data, there's a reason for it. It's because the person's intentionally hid their privacy. It could be because it's a voice over IP number and not a fixed line. It could be that it's a burner phone and a disposable number, which could tell you more about the person and the intent of the person as well. So it's really important for the younger investigators and those who are new to OsInt to embrace the idea that your hard work is not for nothing. As long as you've checked all of your bases, no answer is still an answer. It's the interpretation. Getting the answer is the research phase. The analysis phase will tell you there is data that's meaningful or there's not, and there could be an intention as to why there is no data behind that. Look at a couple of quick examples. Jose Monkey, for example, if you're not familiar with his work, he's absolutely awesome. Great guy, does some really superb geolocation work online where, for fun and games and to test his skills, people send him video clips and he finds where they are. Now, Jose Monkey appears to use what's called the Z method, which we're going to discuss in a minute. I like to use VLC Player. I'm really sure you guys are familiar with the tool, and I use VLC Player in order to create image slices. So you'll see this is I'm just going to rerun that slide for you quickly. On the left-hand side, I'm busy playing a video quickly in VLC Player. And on the right-hand side, you can see the demo directory. It's actually slicing the image as I go so that I can zoom in quite quickly in order to get levels of detail out of individual frames taken from that video. It's a really quick method. And that leads me to the Z search method. So the Z search method, which is, I believe, what Jose Monkey is doing. I don't want to give away all of his tricks, but it's effectively taking a photograph, dividing it up into segments, and they can be 1 inch, 2 inches, doesn't really matter, whatever you choose, and then following a Z pattern, starting top left and moving segment by segment through each segment to identify what can you learn in each segment of each photograph that could give you a further clue as to where the photo was taken, the people in the photograph, the weather conditions, the age of the photograph potentially, and to analyze the photo. So this is a reproducible method. It's a really simple one, and a Z search, if you practice it well enough within a team environment, it's quite easy to reproduce and to decide what kind of skills you're going to work to, so that you know, if you ask one of your colleagues, have you checked the photographs or that photograph or that photograph, you know that the method that they've applied is the same as the one that you would have applied, therefore the result is going to be consistent. As investigators, we all suffer from cognitive bias. It's quite normal. Our eyes want to believe what's in front of us. And it's only by breaking things down into micro detail and really paying attention to each segment of each object that we're able to fight cognitive bias and to push forward and get that result. So Z searches are a really great example of that. Another practical example is scoping and planning. Identify what data you need. Which layer is that data going to be on? And what tools are you going to use in order to acquire the data? Don't touch the keyboard. Put your hands in your pocket. Resist the urge to dive in and start searching. You do not need to do that. Sit and think the problem through first. Understand the problem, understand the desired outcomes, understand where you're going to need to look for that data, what tools you have, and possibly what other tools you might need to get in order to find that answer. Once you've got the fundamentals of your investigative plan in play, then you can move to the next stage, which would be first, work to a minimum method. Use things like bookmark tools to construct your own minimum method. Find tools that enforce using that method. You can always vary it. Don't be stuck in what you're doing. You've got to be flexible, but you need to have a static baseline to work from. Ultimately, it's down to technique. You need to visualize and link your research. Use visual mapping tools. If you don't have access to them, I strongly recommend things like draw.io or Multigo, even for quick link analysis and showing the path and flow of your work. Videos, reduce them to image slices immediately. Use the Z method when you're working with images. Use latches and pivots when you're working with data. Cross-reference your data and authenticate your data. Remember the golden rule? Open source intelligence. So what is intelligence? Quite simple. Information is raw. And okay, we all have different phone numbers around the world, but if I take 3 digits, 4 digits, 3 digits, and it starts with a 08, in South Africa, that would most likely follow the pattern of a cellular phone. So it's information, we're adding structure to it, it becomes data. Information plus structure equals data. Data only becomes intelligence when we give it a value and a context. If you can't contextualize the data in the scale of your investigation, but then it's got no value. It's only when you add context that data becomes intelligence. Intelligence only becomes actionable when it can be cross-referenced and verified from other independent sources. So you always want to try and take 3 different sources to cross-reference your data and get the same answer or an understandable answer to pin the data points together, especially if it is the identification of a suspect, the identification of an address. You want to have more than one data point that confirms that is what I'm looking for. So in a nutshell, that I think brings me almost to time. And it's not an exciting session, I know. I'd love to spend some time with you guys sharing some of my favorite tools, but I think a lot of my colleagues and peers have done an extremely good job of that today. Hopefully I've given you a slightly different way to look at investigative methodology. And if the takeaway from today is that I can just get you to stop, just for half an hour, just stop, leave the keyboard alone, think about the methodology that you apply and how you can improve it. Because if you can't manage it, if you can't measure it, you're never going to be able to manage it. And it will help you to get those reproducible results and to keep stepping up that bar in your investigations. Guys, thank you so much for joining me today. Matt, I'm going to hand back to you. Thanks so much for having me on the session.